All right, here we go. Why are we here? Who are you people? I am Ray Watson, like I said. I use go by they them pronouns. My background is in history and English. I have a master's in history of the book and sexuality from Drury University. My master's in library science is from Indiana University Bloomington. I did archives, digital humanities, knowledge organization, and I just started the very first year of the pandemic PhD in the University of British Columbia. I can't remember the school I'm going to because I haven't been on campus yet. And my focus is on equitable cataloging in GLAMs, which is galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and special collections. So I'm interested in how these kind of cultural heritage institutions can and should use vocabulary from communities that they're describing. So making sure you're using the terminology that the community prefers. I also archive for the American Psychological Association Consensual Non-Monogamy Committee, and I direct the website hissex.org. And Ryan, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ryan, he, him pronouns. I have, I don't know what the specifics about the academic background are super relevant. I've been a student and a scholar, I guess, for probably 10 or 11 years now, which is way too long. It took me about 8 years to do my undergrad, which is, a record of some kind of acclaim. I don't know if it's good or bad. And that was in psych and computer science. Then I switched over to a design background. I completed a design degree at a fancy pants art school in Toronto, Canada. And that was a Master of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation. And nowadays I am a candidate for a PhD in Management Information Systems. And that is like 3-ish years in. I have no idea how long it'll be before I finish it because I'm not in a huge rush. But all of that background sort of has included an interest in how exactly we as societies and as individuals manage information and use that information to solve complex problems. That's really what I'm chiefly interested in. And so that's sort of the focus of my research. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, and I guess the context in general for this about why we decided to do this is, like I already said, Ryan, from the peer pressure. Also just like the rise of personal knowledge management in general, that'll cast in the notes renaissance and the associated apps, Dendron, Roam, Athens, Obsidian, and all the other ones that seem like there's a new few every couple of days. I really came to this to be really interested in this reinvention of the wheel that was happening. Everybody like spinning up their own cataloging classification systems. The benefits to that, because there have been some interesting solutions, and there have been like some drawbacks where people have spent so much time reinventing things that library science have been working on for a year, really, or a decade, a century, really. And Ryan proposed this, which I'm still mulling over. Is there a theoretical basis to ground these phenomena, and what might this teach us about doing good knowledge management? I thought that is a really interesting question. I hope Ryan says a little bit more about it later. So that's just that. So let's just stop the recording in just a second and ask if anybody else would like to introduce themselves or talk about what's interested or your goals for it.
I just want to add, thanks for showing up, everybody. It's I don't know if we expected this kind of a turnout, but even 18 people showing up in person or virtual person to chat about this is pretty overwhelming, and I think motivating for getting us all. We're all in the same boat. I think the academics and non-academics alike. It's a giant textbook. I don't think that many people are ever excited by it, but we're in it together, right? And we're gonna extract what we can from the text.
Yeah, and don't feel like you have to wake up at 4 a.m. if it's not in your usual roundhouse of waking up time, because we will try to record, and feel free to engage in the chat too. Thanks for that, Ryan. All right, so who is this person? I don't know if anybody else looked at the author Denise Bedford bio on the website, but it's just like excessively long. I'm picking out the small little important things here. And this is kind of why I talked a little bit about Ryan and my background as well. The author has a lot of degrees, and I think the bio, more than anything else, like I was interested in the book. I was already pretty sold, but the bio is like, okay, who works for NASA, Intel, University of California, the Goodyear professor, the World Bank, and is a professor at three universities in the Department of State. I was like, what an interesting life. I don't know when she sleeps, but that is really crazy. But I think you can see in like a lot of these introduction and throughout the rest of the book, like how she brings all these different perspectives into it. So I do think it will be an interesting book just because of the view she's able to bring for us to the topic. This is the book. Knowledge Architectures is the blurb from the inside. It reviews traditional approaches to managing information. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with it, so I'm not going to sit here and read all the text on the screen here. Instead, I am going to go to chapter 1, which I'm calling in my head People in Bars, because it does feel a lot like she's like a teacher, a businessman, and a librarian walk into a bar. And when she's doing this specifically is when she's talking about this, she's talking about all the various different kind of approaches these different disciplines take to knowledge organizations as well. She doesn't come out and say this, but this is really her critique section. So she's going to lay out what she disagrees. She's going to lay out what each person says and what she agrees or disagrees with. So just to begin with philosophy. Philosophy, she says it's epistemology. Philosophy's ideas of knowledge. Epistemology is like how you know something and how you know it. So whether or not you know it because you looked at it through a microscope, that's the epistemology of it. But for Denise, that's the knowledge in philosophy is truth, belief, justification, intelligence, wisdom, all of those high vaulting sort of things that we learn in school that what philosophy is, right? But in communications, and this is communication professionals, I would assume network professionals, I would assume people who do write about communication in general, but they treat knowledge as a message exchanged between two different people. And this is a long debate in both in information science, but also in a lot of other different fields about like, how do you know that you understood what this other person said, right? How do you know that you understood, especially when there's this weird vagueness around words like stop or go or over there or over here, and like how do you know what that means? And that's a very long thing, and it ties into linguistics as well. But in communication, knowledge is symbolic representation of meaning. So we're already starting to see like the different disciplines and how they like take things differently. And then there's education, which for education, knowledge is the end goal, right? The goal is to build up a student to know things, to understand things. And the student is that was an accident. Yes, and then of course business. And business is much more straightforward. Knowledge capital is human capital. Knowledge is how do we make money off of it? How did things work? How does this whole business work? And then there's the other 4 that she introduces. It's human resources. It's very similar to business. I'm not really sure if they really need to be distinguished. She seems to think that the human resources developing more into its own field. I'm not quite sure if that's needed to be stated as much. And then economists, and these are intellectual capital, and this is just straight money. How are we going to use this trademark or copyright to make more money and to take over the market? And how is it a competitive advantage? So how can we use it over people we're competing with? And then finally, the last 2 are technologists. She doesn't say in this one paragraph she has about technologists what they think knowledge is, but she does say that technologists place technology in the dominant role and consider how it impacts human workers, which I guess is a sort of knowledge, but I felt like the justification was missing there. And then of course, information professionals have been obsessed with knowledge from the beginning. And this is my field, so I won't go like too deep into it, but but Denise Bedford, she says that knowledge is either derived from information or interchangeable with it, which is what took me forever to wrap my mind around as a library student. So maybe other people have grasped this instantly, but it's like when you look at a book, are you deriving knowledge from it, or is the book itself the knowledge? So it's like that tension, and this is the debate in library science. What one is a document? Is it a document that's useful, or is it what we derive from the document? And I think that I think that's a fair characterization of how library science has agreed. And just looking over all of these, they're all just so different. And I think this is the fair point she's made. She's like, okay, if like all of these really major professions don't agree with what knowledge is, there are gaps here. And then she proposes her own definition, which if you've read the chapter, you know, it's like this part 1, part 2, all the way to part 15. And I was trying to think of a way to present that without reading off 15 bullet points. So I'm going to try to summarize this in the best way that I was able to bring it together. I put the 15 things she says up into 3 different categories: cost, traits, and life and death. The costs are like all of those things around business, management, profit. Knowledge is abundant, like it's not limited. There's not a scarcity. There's a limited knowledge in the world, more or less. It is non-competitive in that even though somebody might make a profit off of it or use it for profit, once it's known, it's not something you can compete against. You learn it and build off of it. It's an experience good and a public good. I'm very vague on what experience good means. If anybody else has deeper insight, feel free. But the idea of a public good is something I think a lot of us have been raised to understand, that it's like something that's good for the public and that anybody can consume it. You can get it in the media, you can get it in a book, and so on. And then she says there are costs associated with getting knowledge. So even though it's non-competitive, free, and it's in the public, there are costs. And anybody that has student loan debt will tell you there's definitely a cost to getting knowledge. The next few I grouped together is the traits of knowledge, and what she says like knowledge is. So she says it's open and it's transparent, and that, like I've just said, it is in the media, it's in the circulation, and that you can examine it and you can look through it and you can find the sources for it. Where does it come from? No knowledge just appears out of a void. It's extensible, collaborative, and interactive. These are all what people do with knowledge, right? Whether that's like building a plugin for Obsidian or Realm or so on, or whether it's working together to solve a common goal, like you've probably seen in all of the Discords or various chat groups that you've been a part of. And it's interactive. And I think some of the best tools and strategies for knowledge help us interact with knowledge in a new and interesting way. And then the last few groupings were things about life and death. And these really struck me as an archivist, especially, in that knowledge is dynamic, continuously changing. And that's true, because we're always thinking like, oh, we should call it this and not that, or we should, I've learned that you now should make a land acknowledgement in, you should refer to the country that you live in, the nation that you live in, as the nation, not like the lands of the nation. So like that is something I've learned. So it really changes my perspective on the nation I live in. And it's infinitely useful, and that's true. I think if you've ever like read a book from the Renaissance, it's still useful to you. If you read Stoic philosophy or pagan philosophy or pagan magic stuff, those are all like old texts often, but they're still useful in the modern life. But it's embedded, so like it's in that context of the world we understand it. So a good example of this is like when we get these little bits of like ancient poetry and we just have no context for it, it's not useful. It's useful in that like it is an ancient piece of poetry, but if it's like a word from Sappho, we have no idea what the rest of the poem is. So once it's lost, and it can be lost, and it can be perishable, it can be transitory. So if you don't preserve that knowledge, if you don't preserve the context it belongs to, then it's lost forever, really. So I just have a couple more slides here for the chapter 1. Yeah, Sappho for sure. So I didn't really know where to put this slide, but this is the rest of the book. I didn't know if I should put it up front, but the rest of the book, outside of, we have a couple more chapters in this first section, but the rest of the book is She's going to talk about how you design systems for availability. So how do people use it, where, when, and how, and then designing it for accessibility, how people access it, seek, search, categorize, describe, and summarize. As a disabled person, I was like, yes, but what? But do you actually mean accessibility, or you just mean accessing? So I will be interested. I will be watching carefully to see if she does talk about disability. And then the last section before the last one, supporting knowledge consumption. And that's how does knowledge change? How do we support it? How do we like build better tools? And then finally, big promise, a coherent, manageable, sustainable, elegant, and holistic knowledge architecture blueprint. By the end of the summer, we will supposedly be able to see this big picture. I'm just going to skip over this. This is all the things that she derives from the principles. We'll come back to it for the discussion if people like. But here they all are, and I will give you the slide too, so you don't have to read this block of text right now. And that's it for me right now. I'm going to stop the recording again. Hopefully, go too long.
Cool. I'm not going to use the thing I was playing with earlier because it might be hard to see, but I should be sharing my screen. You can all see a big black square with a purple line. Great. Yeah, sorry. Okay, good. So I tried to think about the simplest way of presenting this. If you read the chapter, it's 26 pages, I think, but the majority of the chapter focuses on sort of a background, trying to figure out what knowledge assets are by looking at a particular economic lens called intellectual capital. I think it's intellectual capital. I'm not going to walk through that background. I'm going to focus specifically on exactly how the author argues what knowledge assets look like, what they are. And then I think we can get more out of talking about what that argument, about those ideas than we can about looking at the economic background for intellectual capital and all this backing that doesn't necessarily drive straight into the author's 5 types. So yeah, the chapter is the landscape of knowledge assets. And I was hoping as I sat down to read this chapter, it would answer 3 kinds of top level questions. One is, what is knowledge really? Because we didn't exactly, as we just debated with the definitions conversation a second ago, we didn't exactly get a good, solid, robust, easy to use definition from her. And so I was hoping that looking at examples would help draw that out. The second question is, obviously I was hoping she would describe what kinds of knowledge exist in order to, again, point at that definition and find ways of making this practical and usable. And that's really the third thing. Like, as much as I am an academic, I really want to know what all this means for knowledge architectures and for knowledge management. Like, why is this useful? If we dredge up what knowledge assets are, you know, how do we use these and apply these? So I'll try to teach you what the author says about what knowledge assets are through a fun example, an example of coffee and of recipes. And so the author talks about 5 different types of knowledge assets. The first of these look like this: your skill at producing latte art, if you're going to make a cappuccino or a latte and you're working with an espresso machine. The actual ability to make a cappuccino, how you do it, and then also whether you like a cappuccino over a cortado or a latte or whatever. So those are one category, and I'll talk about what it is once I get through all 5. But that's sort of one category of knowledge assets. The second is examples like your grandmother's cappuccino recipe. You know, did she put cocoa on the top after finishing the beautiful rosetta that she worked for 80 years to produce or whatever? And then another type of this particular example, this particular category, is the photo of your latest latte art rosetta on Instagram. The third type that she talks about is thinking about how in a cafe, you might use latte art to show coffee competence and to demonstrate that your cafe is the best, and that's the one that you should go to. The fourth type is the appreciation that the market has for quality coffee and for latte art, and maybe your family values. That might be another example of coffee culture from that tradition of your grandmother. And then the fifth is exchanges of photos about latte art as a way of increasing the value of latte art and culture, and maybe learning to make cappuccinos with your grandmother. So the author lays out these 5 different types, these 5 different examples. And if you're confused about how they relate to one another, or whether if you see some overlap, then you're on the same page as I, and we can talk about that in a bit. But it might get a bit more sensible when you look at the examples that she actually lays out. So this first category she calls human, human knowledge, or human, is it knowledge that she actually uses as a language? I'm looking at the PDF here. Human capital, which I found, right, that's why I forgot it, because that's a super awkward phrase, human capital, which she calls that first area human. And that means the actual skill that you have to be able to, do something that is tacit, that is difficult to maybe put into words. If you've ever seen a barista make a really gorgeous latte or swan or something, you wouldn't be able to just like read how to do that. That skill is more tacit, it's more latent, and therefore it's a kind of knowledge that isn't exactly the same as a recipe, how to make a cappuccino. It's a bit easier to say, steam the milk, make it mostly frothy, pour a shot of espresso, and combine it in a wide cup. So those are two different kinds, but they're both examples of human capital. Again, super awkward. And then the third type that she talks about there is whether or not is attitudes and behaviors. So whether or not you like a cappuccino would be one kind of knowledge in that category. The second she describes as explicit. And these are what we were just talking about in terms of the literal traditions. They're actual recorded concrete artifacts of knowledge. So the written down recipe, a photo. The third type is procedural, and she focuses on the organizational procedures. So again, that's why I tried to use this example of coffee competence in a cafe. She differentiates between this kind of procedural knowledge and the skill knowledge in human capital that I talked about a second ago. So we can maybe tease that out a bit more later. The fourth is cultural. And so this is knowledge that a culture or a group holds about, something. It relates in my mind to the attitudes and behaviors of human knowledge or human capital, but it is focused on the group, focused on culture. And then the fifth is relational. And this is actually the exchange and the learning and the teaching aspects of knowledge transactions. So these are the 5 types of knowledge assets that Bedford draws out in the chapter. And maybe I'll return because I'd like to hear some critiques or questions about these, because I definitely had a few. But first, I'll just finish the slides, and I'm going to try to make lots of room for discussion. I had a few critiques. The first is like the evidence that she draws on here to pull these out is kind of weak in my mind. She uses this idea again of intellectual capital drawn from economic studies of knowledge. But then she talks about things like skills and education, which are like massive, massive, massive fields. Like there are subfields and sub-disciplines within those disciplines. And she doesn't really give any credit to those kinds of fields about skill development and how skills are traded or moved around. Same thing with education. She sort of just dusts it under the rug. And I think that's kind of weak when there's so much out there in terms of education scholarship on how knowledge works. The second, as I mentioned before, is that there's kind of an awkward overlap between these 5 categories. And that to me implies that there's a bit of a the definitions of these 5 categories aren't strict enough. If you can easily sort of say, well, how does a procedural bit of knowledge, how is it not a human capital bit of knowledge, and so on. And then the third is, I didn't see the answer to that third question that I had at the start, which is, okay, we've got these 5 assets, how do we build this into what we're terming a knowledge architecture, and how do we use it? And so those are the big critiques that I had. But ultimately, I do think that the author did a good job of sort of finding and framing the problem here. Like conventionally, we haven't had good definitions of what knowledge assets might be in terms of this modern world of knowledge management. And so we need to find answers, but I'm not satisfied with the answers that she's provided in the chapter. So I'll reposit these 3 questions that I asked at the outset. I don't think we have a great answer of what knowledge is really. I think we've seen a lot of different kinds of knowledge in this chapter, but the overlap between them is not exactly spread out very well. And I'm not exactly sure what it means for knowledge architecture and knowledge management yet. But I'm curious as to what you think. I think that was my last slide. So I'll move back to the 5 different types, and I'll open it up for debate and critique and complaints about my slides as you wish. Thanks for listening.